and indeed, after this experience, Dominic Cummings, are very, very nervous about easing lockdown too quickly. Other members of the cabinet want to see an easing because they're worried about the economic damage. I guess it's going to be next week sometime, I'm guessing, before we're going to hear anything more about lockdown. But back to Priti Patel, back to this mysterious group called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group. And apparently, according to the Home Secretary, the reason we've got no data on those coming into the country with coronavirus is we've been doing no testing at the borders because SAGE said we don't need to do it. Chris says the scientists are right on this. Screening is a waste of time, really. Instead, we should be quarantining everyone as New Zealand did. Chris, we're not doing either, is my response to that. Tom in Basingstoke says this government is guilty of negligence of the safety of the people. The people will have their day at the ballot box. Well, it may be a very long time, Tom, before we have another general election. Negligence is a very strong word, but I have to say, in relation to our borders, it's one I would use, and I wouldn't just use it, by the way, about airports. This continuing tide of people coming across the English Channel too, which makes me so angry. Let's come up to Liverpool and speak to Alexander, who's a new caller to me. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, was the Home Secretary's defence acceptable today?
So I think the justification for not screening and testing individuals who are arriving in the country at the moment is sound. Because at the moment we are one of the epicentres in the world, and indeed in Europe.
That is now that is true. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think going forward, it may become more of an imperative to screen new arrivals. But I think the points you raise about the lack of transparency around how SAGE is making its decisions,
yes,
I think is an important one. And I think the science. I mean, I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist as well. I think science thrives when it operates in an environment of transparency. So I think we need to know what data, on what basis did they make those decisions, how did they make those decisions, and all decisions require a trade-off. But I think saying right now that we should be testing new arrivals is the wrong message. I think we should be focusing inwardly right now because currently we are one of the epicenters.
No, I get that point. Alexander, and it's a sobering point, but it is of course very true. But what I find extraordinary is, there are 130 countries around the world that have taken measures about flights coming into their countries. In fact, some countries in January restricting flights coming into their nation, and we've done nothing. Doesn't that look lax or negligent?
You could definitely criticise in general the government's response to the coronavirus. I think it's that maybe perhaps back in February when Italy had its epidemic, when it would have been sensible to take some of the messaging and some of the EU
What was saying at the time?
I was when you remember everything was on the if I may say, obviously your political background, we have to acknowledge that immigrants have played an enormous role in controlling this epidemic, and disproportionately the doctors and my colleagues that have been affected by coronavirus, and indeed doctors who have
I don't think we've been importing people to work in hospitals, have we, in the last couple of months?
No, but I'm saying they've overwhelmingly come from ethnic minority immigrant backgrounds, and I think just to use this as yet another means to sort of, I don't want to use too emotive language, but to demonise immigrants.
Well, I'm sorry, Alexander, with all due respect, that's utter tosh. But what would be nice would be to think that perhaps in the years going ahead from now, in all sorts of areas, such as antibiotics, that perhaps we could become self-sufficient and not reliant upon China. Maybe that's a lesson we can draw from this pandemic. But also, what I have argued for years is why do we train so few now of our own nurses and doctors and often take people from countries where their skills are desperately needed? There's a moral dimension here, Alexander, to taking people in from countries that desperately need medical workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely we should aim to be self-sufficient in terms of our medical nursing staff.
Yes.
And I think that's very important when we think in terms of, depleting from countries that have a shortage of medical staff. So I think that's very
good. Alexander, nice to talk to you. Great stuff, thank you. Let's go to Hackney and speak to Miriam, another new caller. Miriam, good evening.
Good evening.
So, what did you? I mean, Was it acceptable that the Home Secretary says we haven't done this because this committee told us not to? Is that how the country should be run?
Absolutely not. They can listen to the science, but eventually they're the ones who make the decisions.
Yes.
Looking around other countries have been a lot more protective of the borders, and I think we should have been so too.
Yeah, and why weren't we? Do you think it's a sort of lack of confidence? Do you think we're scared of stopping people at
I think
borders?
they were trying to protect themselves, trying to protect the economy in many ways. Yeah, they were scared. They wanted to. We have so many ships in Israel, and they have been tested at the border, and came back that they actually have antibodies, and still they have been quarantined for 2 weeks because, we want to ensure that that will not get reinfected. So I'm going to make them a lot more cautious, and I think that's taken care of, and I think we have been negligent in basically what done.
Well, I have to say, Mary, I'm there. Now, let's look ahead, right? I think dreadful mistakes have been made, but let's look ahead. And let's think, in a few weeks' time, there is going to be an easing of some kind, and maybe schools will start going back, or whatever it is. But we, of course, the biggest fear, I guess, any of us have will be that this comes back again in October, or whatever it is, with a second wave. Would it, even though we haven't been testing and screening and quarantining for the last few months, would it make sense to do it in future?
Absolutely, because as many cases as you can prevent from entering the country, you can flatten the peak earlier, you can make less people get infected. I think one should be doing anything they can to get less cases into the country and to try and minimize, the infections to other people.
Yeah. No, Miriam, I think we're going to have to think very hard about it going ahead to try and stop a second wave. I really do. Miriam, thank you very much for your call, for your passion. Andrew in Manchester says, Nigel, 100%, we should have quarantined. Patel was talking like she was in a game show, like Call My Bluff. She waffled on and didn't sound as though she knew what she was on about. And I don't really agree with that, Andrew. I think she did know what she was on about. I think what she was saying, Andrew, what she was really saying was, it's not me, Gov. This is the advice we got. The government took the advice and followed it. I personally don't agree with it. That's what I took from Priti Patel today. Neil says, Nigel, the government is hiding behind the following the science mantra far too much. As you say, scientists rarely agree, hence the system of peer review, which we don't do here. Yeah, look, whenever you hear the science is settled on anything, know that it's rubbish. I remember in the 70s, the science being settled that we had global cooling, we were going back into another ice age. And now we're told the science is settled, we've got global warming. Science is dynamic, it keeps changing and moving. Toby is in Windsor, a new caller. Good evening, Toby.
Good evening, Nigel. Hope you're well.
I'm very well.
Glad to hear. I rarely agree with you, but recently I have been a lot more. It seems a bit silly to me. I've had friends that are Italian that went back quite early, actually, about a month and a half, 2 months ago. They were getting quarantined.
Yes.
They were having to go to houses on their own and spend 2-3 weeks there. So it just seems a bit haphazard, like the whole lockdown has been. It's like we're kind of locked down, but we're kind of not. We're watching the borders, but we're kind of not.
I keep being criticised, Toby. I keep being told I'm being too anti-government, but I'm not trying to be. I mean, instinctively I want to support the government in a crisis, but it does, at every level, look like we follow things and not lead them, doesn't it?
No, I agree. It's no worse. It's no worse. Can I ask you one question, though, sorry, Nigel?
Go on.
It's about following the scientists, and scientists always come to a conclusion. Do you think they've come to a conclusion about Donald Trump injecting Deadly? Or do you think there will be scientists?
I didn't hear him mention Deadly, did you?
Bleach, sorry, whatever it was.
I didn't hear him mention bleach, no, did you?
Disinfectant, sorry.
Right, disinfectant, which we all ran away with ourselves and took to be bleach. Look, I think it was a wrong use of the word, all right? But you know what? I'll tell you what, Toby. Trump was doing 2-hour press conferences, talking off the cuff, taking questions for 2 hours. You are, of course, in 2 hours, going to make some mistakes, all right? Contrast that to our press conferences, where you get a minister reads out a pre-prepared statement for about 12 minutes and then refuses to answer any question. Maybe the answer to leadership and press conferences is somewhere in the middle. I don't know. Toby, thank you very much for your call. Alan in Whitstable says, Nigel, I am concerned about the mantra, following the science. What happens if the variables are flawed? In which case the government has been foolish to go blindly with 6:30, time for the news with Thomas Watts.
The number of people who've died with COVID-19 in the UK has risen sharply to more than 26,000. For the first time, the government's official figures include deaths in care homes and the community, as well as those in hospitals. Overseas midwives, social workers and pharmacists working in Britain are to be granted free visa extensions for a year. It widens a scheme announced last month for doctors, nurses and paramedics whose status was due to expire. Unions have vowed to fight plans to cut 12,000 jobs at British Airways. Officials say the move is entirely at odds with the course of action followed by other European carriers as they seek a way through the coronavirus crisis. And the weather, heavy rain spreading across much of the UK tonight, +3 in the southwest, a low of 6 degrees.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7.
The idea of masks and sadly would appear rather disunited kingdom to wear or not to wear. Professor Sir David King, sworn chief scientific advisor to the UK government.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Xero. Get your business digital ready with Xero accounting software.
LBC.
This is a message from the government about the emergency measures to support the economy during the period of disruption caused by the coronavirus. To help you, your business and your workers affected, you can apply for cash grants, business rate holidays, statutory sick pay relief packages, as well as the coronavirus job retention and self-employment income support schemes. For information, go to gov.uk/business-support now.
Attention, please. We at HealthSpan would like to tell you something that quite possibly you didn't already know. Not all supplements are created equal. I know. Who'd have thought? We work harder to seek out the best ingredients for our supplements. From the southern slopes of India for our turmeric, to the cold, crisp seas of Greenland for our cod liver oil. Because that's the HealthSpan way. Well, there you go. It's not every day you learn something new, is it? We're HealthSpan. That's healthspan.co.uk. Vitamins and supplements in store or direct to your door.
If you've been waiting for an ear, nose or throat appointment, the current situation can mean you're forced to wait even longer. But there is another option open to you. The High Street ENT Clinic is one of the few private clinics in London that remains open, offering expert consultations in person with protective measures in place, or by video call if you prefer to stay at home. Find out more at harleystreetent.com. harleystreetent.com. At Vodafone, we know how important it is to stay connected, now more than ever. Whether you're keeping the family entertained at home or staying close to loved ones far away, switch to Vodafone Superfast Broadband and stay connected for only £22.95 a month. Available online today. Keeping the UK connected. Ready? Vodafone.
24-month contract credit check acceptance and price rise may apply. Superfast average speeds from 35 megabits per second. Vodafone.co.uk/broadband.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC, The Nigel Farrow Show.
We're following the science. We heard it from the start and we're here today from the Home Secretary. That's why we have no data about people coming into our country because we haven't tested anybody. She says it's because SAGE said we had to. But surely, Priti Patel, this is for governments to decide, not scientists. That's my view. What does Eve in Shepperton, a new caller, think of that? Good evening, Eve.
Good afternoon, Nigel. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And what makes people, since we've been on the shutdown, be coming into the country in the highest toll that we have in Europe? Where are they going and what is attracting them to come here?
Well, I think the truth is, actually, Eve, I think now, with the 10,000 or so a day that are coming in, I think most people that are coming in now are actually Brits returning from all over the world. But of course, you know, we have net migration into Britain. We also have a lot of tourism into Britain as well. I mean, 130 countries in the world have limitations on flights into their country. Some very, very severe, and we haven't. Why haven't we, Eve?
Well, I have no idea, but I tell you something, it is absolutely madness. We are cowering in our homes, telling us not to go out, and we're not going out. But all these people are milling around. Where are they? What are they doing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in fact, Priti Patel was confronted by Ruth Edwards, a Conservative MP today, who said the British in from coronavirus hotspots every day with no quarantine measures at all. She was right, really, wasn't she?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no.
Absolutely. And I just agree with it. And I hope the country rises up and says, no COVID anymore.
Well,
And that's it. The trains aren't flying out, so why are they coming in?
well, I think, as and when we ease, we may well have to think about restrictions, even if we've missed the boat for the last 2 months. Eve, thank you. Now, education. Perhaps a glimmer of hope? I don't know. Do children want to go back to school? I'm sure some do and some don't. But Education Secretary Gavin Williamson was giving evidence today in front of the Education Select Committee, and he was asked about plans for schools reopening.
We are working very closely with the whole sector in terms of actually when is going to be the best time to bring the schools fully back into operation. We have set out 5 clear tests as to what's incredibly important and what will inform the opening of the schools. We want to make sure that schools are given proper notice, but we do want to have a date as to when schools are going to be opening.
Do you imagine when they do open, it will be in stages? And would you favour primary opening first or secondary schools opening first?
This is obviously something that we are giving a great amount of thought to and giving a lot of consideration. Just a couple of weeks ago, I commissioned SAGE to set up a subgroup to look at the particular issues of opening schools, making sure that when schools are open, it's done in the best possible way with the very best scientific and medical advice. And we expect SAGE reporting back, and the information that we get from SAGE along with Public Health England will be the key parts of what informs us to how best we open schools. But I do expect schools to be opened in a phased manner. I also intend to be giving schools as much notice as possible.
So once again, it's SAGE. That's where the advice is going to come from. Well, let's speak to an educationalist. Let's speak to Sir Anthony Selden, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. Sir Anthony, good evening. Welcome again to LBC.
Thank you, Nigel. Nice to be on.
So, I'm sure there are lots of children who can't wait to get back to school, some who probably are rather enjoying not being there. But are the schools ready, and could they cope? I mean, some people were saying that there'd be sort of, one year group in one day, another year group in the next day. Are the schools in 2 or 3 weeks' time going to be ready to do this?
Yes, but they do need notice, Nigel, because it's a lot of stuff that you have to get ready, and teachers are quite tired. They're finding often that teaching online, that sounds much easier than being there in a classroom, is in fact really tiring as you try to engage everybody in the classes. So they're quite tired, but they will be up for it. But the more notice, the better. And I think that the children too, quite do want to get back and see their friends. They're probably, some of them, not that keen to have lessons. That's their friends, the friends and the fun of it. Yeah.
Well, imagine, okay, so let's put yourself in a position of an 8-year-old, okay? You haven't seen your mates for a number of weeks because of social distancing measures and all the rest of it, and you're back in the playground. How on earth are 8-year-olds going to social distance when they haven't seen each other for nearly 2 months?
Well, it's impossible. You put your finger on that. I mean, do they understand what some of them, even if they do understand what 6 foot is and social distance is and the importance of it for their own and their families' health to avoid picking this dreadful bug up, will they be able to restrain themselves? I mean, they're very tactile, very physical children, girls, very physical, boys very physical in different ways, and whatever they might say and be told, the imperative, the excitement is going to
Of course. Yeah, well, I think so too. And can I just finish with an interesting point? You talked about online teaching. Now, I've seen a bit of a divide within my family. I've got a daughter at a private school, and she is having online teaching, and I have to say, I'm paying for it, I know, but I'm highly impressed with it. I've got other members, close members of my family, teenage children who are going to good state schools, but There's no online teaching at all. They're being asked to submit written work. They're not even sure whether it's being tested. Are we getting, through this period, a bigger divide between the private sector and the state sector?
Undoubtedly, Nigel, and not just between private and state, but within the state sector, between those children whose parents are lucky enough to be good at, confident at, have the time for homeschooling themselves, have access to the best technologies, have space in the house where they can be in quiet. This is the biggest.
So there's a financial issue here too with that. Yes.
Huge issue of that, and then there's also the mental health of young people and the fear that they have. I mean, it's really distressing for them. So the gulf is growing between those who are at schools that are, for all the best intentions of teachers in many state schools, they don't have the equipment often, and the class sizes are much bigger than in the private schools.
Yes.
So they're trying their best, but they're thwarted, and so that gap is growing between disadvantaged and advantaged, and also between those who don't have mental health issues and those who do. So the sooner we can be back and safely, Nigel, the better.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Thank you very much indeed. Sir Anthony Selden, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. And we've touched on this before. There are two types of lockdown. Some people's experience of lockdown is fine. For others, it's very, very difficult. And the thought that there are children, the most disadvantaged, falling further behind is very bad. Let's get back to the science. We're following the science. But should the government, in this case, have overruled SAGE? And should we have done some checks and quarantining at airports? Noosh in Holland Park says, SAGE is made up of more than 100 bright scientists. Unfortunately, they could also be influenced by Dominic Cummings. This was the report that Dominic Cummings had attended or taken part in some of the meetings. But I tell you what, Noosh, if you get 100 bright people together in a room or on a conference call, the thought of getting unanimity of agreement is very limited indeed. On Twitter, Alice says it's mind-boggling that two of the supposedly most developed countries, the UK and the US, have dealt with this crisis so incredibly poorly. Let's go to Greville, who's calling from Kenilworth in Warwickshire. Greville, good evening.
Yes, good evening. I agree with you on the border control. I mean, we're making fools of ourselves, and the rest of the world is looking on in wonderment. Calais, in particular, is becoming a crisis point that we've created. I mean, the French, understandably, will simply keep on waving spare migrants through there, and we're picking them up at sea and delivering them across the other side, mainly to Dover. In terms of SAGE, they're not infallible, and I'm reminded of that Supreme Court decision where they quickly discussed prorogation and came to an 11-11 decision, totally unanimous against it.
11.
And again, as you said yourself, how you could get unanimity with lots of very bright, very different disciplined scientists or whatever they are.
Impossible.
That is virtually impossible.
I know. And yet, Greville, ever since the beginning of this, we're presented by government ministers and the Prime Minister this concept that we're following the science as if there is some sort of unarguable fact that they've been presented. It's nonsense, isn't it?
It is. There may be a few ideas, there may be a few theories, but like all of them, even Einstein struggled before he got his sums right and his theories right. And you know, it's utterly ridiculous because at the end of the day, open borders is not a scientific question. It's a question
It's a political question, isn't it? Well, do you know what? We're almost back to the same debate, aren't we? Whether it's SAGE, Greville, whether it's the civil service, whether it's special advisors. At the end of the day, it's elected government ministers that have to make these decisions. Greville, thank you very much indeed. Tony in Iverne says, my wife is a teacher and there's no way she's going back. She'll resign first. The education authorities and councils can't even organise teaching the ABCs, let alone a crisis like this. Well, I'm sure in education there's everything. There's some and some. Studious evasion and non-speak from Gavin Williamson, Andrew tweets this evening as he tries to explain nothing at all about school starting again. Come on, Conservatives, get a grip. Yeah, actually have a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, but we have a President. And nobody dares give an opinion until the President has spoken. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I tell you what, we'll debate that another evening. But for now, it's 6:45 and time for the news headlines with Thomas Watts.
The number of people who've died with COVID-19 in the UK has risen sharply to more than 26,000. For the first time, the government's official figure includes deaths in care homes and the community, as well as those in hospitals. And overseas midwives, social workers and pharmacists working in Britain are to be granted free visa extensions for a year. Today's weather, heavy rain spreading across much of the UK later, blustery in the West Country, a low of 6 degrees.
LBC Travel, I'm Dave Goff in Gravesend. The A2 eastbound is blocked. That's because of an accident at the tollgate services, so there are queues. On the M25 anti-clockwise, 2 lanes stay closed between Clackett Lane services and junction 5 for the M26 for emergency repairs after there was an accident there this morning. In Marylebone, Portman Street is closed both ways between Oxford Street and Seymour Street because of emergency repairs. On the trains, Southeastern have delays of up to 25 minutes between Rainham and Rochester after electrical supply problems earlier on. On the Underground, the Waterloo and City and Circle Line stay suspended. The advice is to only travel if your journey is essential.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Testing, death rates, paternity leave, schools returning in a phased way. Lots to get your teeth into in our open coronavirus phone-in from 8.
Ian Dale on LBC.
If running a business wasn't challenging enough, being forced to operate a business remotely can be the difference between sink or swim. It can be tough to collaborate with your team without the appropriate technology. And as IT experts, Vertigan can help. With Vertigan, you can be certain that your business is functioning at its best. Vertigan.com. That's VIRTIGON.com. Vertigan. Keeping your business running.
It's time for some truth. Time to settle once and for all that nagging doubt about whether you've been missold. If you've lost money...